Okay, well, hola everyone. El Profesor Cañedo here, and the heat made a bit of a comeback the last few days, so I'm back inside the confines of the French Friendly World headquarters to give you the preview of this week's reading. So here we are now in week 5, and our topic this week is the decline and collapse of Spanish and English colonial rule in North America. Um, so basically, for this week in this module, we're going to be going back and forth with respect to what's happening in not only with Mexico in some of the early stages and events leading up to the period of Mexican independence, and the focus will actually be more on topics happening in Europe. So Spain will still be a major feature here, but also we'll take a look at what's happening in the early United States too, and the and the film that this week is about the early stages of the Mexican Revolution with the old History Channel film Bloody Boston. So with our next couple of films, we're actually going to be leaving Mesoamerica. We're going to be leaving Mexico and shift our focus a bit more to what's happening with the United States with the Boston film this week and the Andrew Jackson film coming up for next week. We don't have any films scheduled for the final week of the session. Um, um, but as I mentioned, the last two films for these next couple of weeks, starting this week, will focus in mainly on what's happening in the United States. But still, plenty of coverage about what's happening with respect to Mexico and Spain, and there'll be quite a bit of that in this week. So, without further ado, everybody, let me go and get things started and give you the preview for this week's readings. Okay, the first thing you should do for this week is to check out the powerful program about the legendary novel Don Quixote de la Mancha. And the reason I have this program for you is that even though this topic might be geared better toward a literature class or maybe the world history or maybe one of the world history classes. I think my colleague Professor Ryan, I think she gets into world history, so maybe she covers this in her classes. But I want you to get a sense of the contradictory nature of Spanish society in the time of the early 17th century when Don Quixote was published. The book was actually published in two stages, once around 1605 and again about 10 years later when when part two, that is the conclusion, came out. Basically, what happened was Miguel de Cervantes was getting a little bit frustrated that there were some people who were, you might say, engaging in early forms of copyright infringement and essentially copying what he had done. And uh, so to show off these people, I tell them, no, you guys, you clowns, I'm the real guy who wrote Don Quixote. I'm the master, blah blah blah. So I'm going to put the sequel out right now. I guess it'd be much like if let's say somebody decided to make a Harry Potter story, which is different names and characters, but obviously blatant ripoff. And J.K. Rowling got wind of it, so obviously the thing she could have done is slap to try to get an injunction, file a lawsuit, or maybe she just write more of the story of Harry Potter. Essentially, that's what Cervantes did with the story. But the essence of Don Quixote is that it shows that Spain in the early parts of the 17th century, the early 1600s, was in a bit of a, you might say, schizophrenic character in that Spain was still a country which had a lot of, I guess you could say, medieval ideas. And of course, anybody who's traveled in Spain, I was fortunate to do so with my dad about 30 years ago. Uh, you definitely get a sense of that. If you leave, that it's not just in Madrid, but if you leave the city, go the outlying areas. There's castles everywhere. You definitely get a sense that you're in the medieval times, the Middle Ages. So Spanish society was, you might say, really struggling to go from old times. Um, Medieval or archaic times and go into the modern world because Don Quixote in essence represented the idea that it's a brave new world, that there's new advances in terms of technology, exploration, new ideas and new ideas in governance, which of course would be a hallmark with the early stages of the United States. Don Quixote represented that, whereas his sidekick, the Sancho Panza, you might say represented order, stability. He wasn't that interested in going out. He wasn't. He thought his friend and master was loco la cabeza. You might say, but over time, you might say Sancho becomes quite interested in Don Quixote's ideas and Don Quixote's dreams, whereas ironically, it is Don Quixote who starts to become disillusioned with his dreams and dies a pretty sad death. But again, the point of it here is that Don Quixote represents the idea that that in Spain you've got these two poles, you might say, pulling against each other, and it's hard to tell what direction Spain is going in. And when it comes to Spanish politics and society, it's a good metaphor because on the one hand you have order, stability, structure, orthodoxy, purity of religion, the strict confines of the Catholic Church. But on the other hand, you've got people like Cortes and of course Columbus, who represented the idea that you have to take chances, you have to see the world, find new places, that type of thing. So this clash between modernization and old archaic structures, traditional views, old fuddy-duddy ideas, that would be a clash that would really complicate uh, Spain's history and culture for not just the 17th century, but on into the 18th century too. So the essence of that is the gist of what the POWER program is all about. So definitely uh, start the module this week with the Don Quixote PowerPoint program. Now, after you see that, go to the next PowerPoint program and take a look at the collapse of the Spanish Empire um, because where we left off from last week, the Spanish crown, the Spanish monarchy, seemed to be stabilizing by the 18th century. The Habsburgs had essentially died off when Charles the Third died. I'm sorry, Charles II. So after Charles II's death, uh, the Bourbons from France have come on the throne, and the Bourbons really reset the table in terms of new ideas, in terms of modernization, more efficient government, bureaucracy, things of this nature. And of course, it's during the Bourbon time when King Charles, Carlos III, is king, when the Spaniards begin to engage in more exploration, especially places like California with Father Serra and Captain de Portola. But with the death of Charles III in 1788, all hell breaks loose. Charles III's son, Charles IV, is really a dum-dum. He's a doofus. He's a tonto, tarugo, idiota. You get the idea. This guy doesn't know what the hell to do. So it's no surprise that under his tenure, the Spanish Empire just falls to pieces. And what complicates things for Spain is the fact that you've got the French Revolution taking shape in 1789. The French Revolution has a lot of, shall we say, uh, uh, vanguard and radical ideas in terms of liberty, democracy, freedom of speech, destruction of the monarchy, destruction of the old order. So if you were someone in Spain who was a big fan of the king, of monarchy, of Catholic traditions, power of the army, blah blah, all of this stuff. You saw what's happening north on the border in France. You pretty much that scared the hell out of you. So what happened is for the next 20 years after Charles III dies, Spain essentially seals itself off from all revolutionary ideas, tries to go back to the old days, that type of thing. But that would prove to be disastrous because what complicates things with the French Revolution is the rise of Napoleon. So when Napoleon Bonaparte comes on the scene, things really start to unravel. So to make a long story short, by the time we get to 1808, when Charles the Fourth has been deposed as the king of Spain, and Joseph Bonaparte, Napoleon's brother, is installed as the king. There's nobody running the store in Spain. There's no order. There's no direction. Who's in charge here? What do we do? Do we engage in more liberalism, or do we go back to the old way of thinking? Blah blah blah. That type of stuff is happening in 1808. So if you're living in, say, Mexico City, Guadalajara, Santiago, Buenos Aires, Havana, any of those places in the Spanish colonies, and you're seeing what's happening in Madrid and the rest of Spain with the collapse of the monarchy, you don't know what to do because you depend so much on the direction from the central government back in Spain. So the colonists are quite interested in terms of what's happening. So the main point I'll get to in just a few minutes is that when there's no order back in the home country, what do the colonists do? And not surprisingly, some colonists over time begin to take it upon themselves and say, well, we can't depend on the king. There is no king. We don't like this Joseph Bonaparte guy. He's a borracho. He's a payaso. He's Pepe Botellas. That was actually his nickname at the time. He was considered a drunkard, and everybody called him Pepe Botellas. So you've got some people in the Spanish colonies, of course, Mexico, which was still called New Spain, the the Andean regions, of course, of Venezuela, Colombia, and of course the River Plate republics, Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, those places. The elites and a lot of the upper middle class are wondering, well, if we can't count on Spain to govern us, maybe we should take care of our own affairs. So keep that idea in mind, everybody. I'll get to that idea in just a bit. So a lot of these ideas that I just mentioned are illustrated in the collapse of the Spanish Empire PowerPoint program. After that, I've got three articles from Wikipedia. The articles are about the Cortes of Cádiz, which means the Parliament of Cádiz. Cádiz, of course, is a famous port town in the south of Spain, overlooking the Mediterranean. And Cortes. This is different from Cortes. Cortes, of course, is the proper name, so the accent is on the second syllable. But Cortes, without the accent, means parliament, assembly, legislature, that type of thing. So what happens in Spain is that when there's no king, there's basically nobody running the show in terms of a monarchy, except for this French dude who's installed there to the throne by his brother. You've got some upper middle class merchants and liberal thinkers who are quite interested in ideas of the French Revolution and the American Revolution, which had actually happened, of course, around the time right before the French Revolution. Uh, these people in Cadiz are thinking that, well, we don't have to. There's no king here. We should take care of our own affairs. So we like the ideas of Thomas Jefferson, John Locke, Rousseau, Thomas Paine, all of those people. So let's try to set up Spain and maybe have Spain as a uh, more liberal nation. That is much like what the Americans are doing. Maybe we can do that in Spain. So radical idea for Spain at the time, but what these guys in Cadiz were talking about. Um, as they kept meeting in Cadiz, they actually drafted a constitution called the Constitution of 1812. That's the second Wikipedia article. And in this, it gets into ideas of national sovereignty, freedom of the press, and constitutional monarchy, which essentially means that that the monarchy, the king, he has to answer to a parliament, or in other words, his power is limited or restricted by that of a parliament or another or an elected body of representatives. In other words, you're going to try to cut the power of the monarchy and and limit the power of all the other colonial imperial institutions. That's the gist of the Constitution of 1812. Um, well, as I mentioned in the module essay, there were some in Spain who thought that was a bad idea. What is this? What is this garbage? This liberal stuff? Look at these clowns. They're talking about freedom of democracy, freedom of speech, freedom of the press. We want the power of the king back. We want. Long live the king. Let's bring the king back. Yeah, that type of thing. So, to make a long story short, uh, um, the king that is the king's son, Prince Ferdinand, who's now King Ferdinand, comes back into power and basically said, "You liberals in Cadiz and all you guys, you're too French. Ustedes son afrancescados. That is, you have too much French influence." So what happens when King Ferdinand comes back to the throne after the Peninsular Wars had taken shape in Spain? King Ferdinand engages in a brutal reign of terror against his political opponents, including many liberal thinkers who had met in Cadiz to try to organize Spain, try to modernize Spain in more of a liberal democratic or a liberal democratic state. Well, as King Ferdinand tries to restore order and he sees what's happening in the colonies too, because there are some people revolting too, which I'll get to in just a bit, with of course Father Hidalgo and Father Morelos. Um, there were quite a few people of the army, these junior officers, who didn't like the way they were being treated by the king. Try to say that 10 times fast. So as these junior officers were upset with the antics of the king, and they felt that they were being disrespected by the king, they organized a revolt. And this is the third Wikipedia article. It's the article by on Rafael Riego. Captain Riego was a major in the Spanish army, in the Royal Army, but he did not like the way that his men were being treated, and he organized a mutiny, a revolt, against the power of the king, against the monarchy. This happened back in 1820. Well, at this point in time, everything. Well, gee, Professor, what does this have to do with what's happening in the Americas? It seems like you're focusing a little bit too much more on what's happening in Spain and the intrigue that's going on. But what's the connection between what's happening here in what's happening in Spain and what's happening in the Americas? Well, here's the connection. Um, because Captain Riego organized this revolt and launched a mutiny, which was actually quite successful, and actually forced the king to capitulate and accept the Constitution of 1812, a constitution which he rejected a few years earlier. When news of this gets back to the colonies back in Mexico, back in Peru, Guatemala, Central America, uh, the Caribbean, all those places, there were a lot of upper class people in the Americas who wanted the king back. They felt that, well, with the king back in power, everything will be back in order. We'll go back to the old way of doing things, blah blah blah. But the thing was, there were a lot of the elites, the upper class elites in the Americas, who were quite angry at the way King Ferdinand was trying to restore power. But when the but when the king was but when the king was a victim of this mutiny that was launched against him by Captain Riego, um, this really upset the elites in the Americas more, because now they're thinking was, well, who's in charge here? We don't know what's going to happen from one day to the next. The king is in power, then Captain Riego, then the king's back in power, then this and that, blah, blah, blah. So to make a long story short, there was so much chaos and turmoil back in Spain that a lot of the elites, the upper classes in the Americas, who favored the king early on, but now they saw what's happening in this uprising by the members of the Royal Army. Many of the elites said, "That's enough. We've had enough of this. We don't know what direction to go in." So it was at that point when many of the upper class said, "Okay, we're going to support independence. We got to break away because we want to take care of our own affairs. We don't have any direction from Spain because of all the chaos and confusion." So that's the point of what's happening in what's happening. And so with the empire in so much turmoil by 1819, 1820, the upper class in the Americas, including those in Mexico, they're the ones who say, okay, we're going to go ahead and support independence. Uh, Father Hidalgo, of course, up until this point in time, and I'll get to more Hidalgo, probably coming up in the next week's yeah, in next week's module. Uh, Father Hidalgo had been fighting, of course, and then and then Father Morelos, of course, was his right hand man. Uh, but when this turmoil takes shape in the Spanish Empire by the late 1810s, early 1820s, that's what convinces a lot of the upper class in the Americas that independence was the best option to go. And of course, I'll get into more of that coming up into next week. Okay, all right. After you check out the Wikipedia articles, then go on and read the Between the Conquest readings by Mike Cornelis, David Weber, and also a little short reading on what's called the Transcontinental Treaty of 1819. Uh, uh, in Mike's section in Between the Conquest, he gives a pretty good panorama of the events in Chicano history in the first half of the 19th century. That's the early 1800s. So what Mike does is give you a pretty good sketch or a panorama of a lot of key events that, of course, we're looking at in this week's module and into next week, and also into the final week's readings too. And then in David Weber's section, he talks about the decline of the Spanish missions because keep in mind, everybody, with all this chaos taking shape in Spain, like I described earlier, whether it was King Ferdinand, whether it was Joseph Bonaparte, and of course with Charles IV, with all the chaos taking shape in Spain, the missions are suffering badly. The missions in California, New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, all of those places, especially California, and that's what Weber talks about in his readings in Between the Conquests. All right. Okay. At this point in time, so that concludes the Spain and Spain and the Americas portion for the module. The second part of the module, now let's get into a little bit more about North America, that is the early United States, and also events taking shape in England. So check out the PowerPoint program on social and political change in the English colonies, because what's happening here is that we've got some events happening in the English colonies. Of course, the original 13, of course, New York, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, Virginia, Delaware, New Jersey. Of course, you get the idea. By the middle parts of the 18th century, um, the English colonists, they were essentially forced to join sides with the mother country. Of course, this been England in one of a many of series of wars that against their main rival, France. Since about the tail end of the 17th century, there had been about 3, 4 major conflicts between the English and the French, and these battles were pretty much raged all over the country, in the Caribbean, of course in Europe, and the Americas too. So the final war for empire in North America was called in Europe the 7 Years' War, but in North America it's called the French and Indian War. And even though when the French and Indian War ended and the French were kicked out of present day Canada, and of course in the South and present day Louisiana, because of course the French were the ones who had settled there first, the first Europeans. Um, Many of the English colonists were happy. Yay, we got the dirty French out. All of North America is English now. We're going to have crumpets and tea and say tally ho and all of that fun stuff. But what happened was because that war was so costly, the 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 English Parliament, with the approval of the king at the time, and that's when King George comes on the scene. He becomes king roughly around 1759, 1760. Uh, Parliament has the bright idea that they want to make the colonists essentially pay their fair share for the war effort, and that's where the infamous Stamp Act comes on the scene. And when the Stamp Act comes on the scene, which the people in England, the members of Parliament, they didn't think it was a big idea. For the colonists, it was outrage. It was this. It was that. It was no taxation without representation. Basically, the main gist of it was the colonists felt that they were not consulted on this tax. They were just being taxed uh, because the English crown had the power to tax them. And that's not unlike the argument that you hear a lot of people, of course, where the present day Tea Party gets its ideas. And of course, the Tea Party name comes from the famous Boston Tea Party, which you'll look at next. So after you take a look at uh, the the England Parker program, watch the film Boston Bloody Boston. It was a Great History Channel film which came out about 10 years ago. In that one, we get more about some of the early stages of the American Revolution with events like the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, Paul Revere's Midnight Ride, and of course the events at Lexington and Concord in 1775 in Massachusetts, which in essence were the opening shots of the American American Revolution, I try to say. Okay. Oh, all right. So there are notes about the film, so definitely check out those notes as you're watching the film. The film is embedded in page 4 of the module, so just skip ahead to page 4 to watch the film. It's embedded right there. And after you view the film, then take a look at the U.S. Lecture Outline 5. In that outline, that basically fills the gaps uh, in the Boston film and also in the PowerPoint program that you just looked at earlier. Okay, finally, the final three items to look at for this week. It's the it's you might say the opening stages or the opening events of the United States. That is some of the key events which um, which predicate the formation of the United States, and of course the main event is the American let me take some tea here. Maybe that'll help here. American Revolution. American Revolution. I try to say. All right. So it's early 1776, and basically, the colonies and the British crown are at an impasse. The events in Boston didn't lead to any type of political resolution. So no, no, no side is willing to budge on their position. Uh, um, so at this point in time, read the article by Benjamin Rader. Rader essentially gives you an idea that even though the colonies in early 1776 really didn't know what direction to go to, they already had ideas. They already had were developing independent traditions, independent viewpoints, independent assemblies, new ideas of thinking, the Great Awakening, Enlightenment stuff we looked at in last week's module. So, in Rader's readings, you'll read about that, and of course, you read about the formation of the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence, basically, what it does is it captures the American mind, the American mindset at that point in time. Because what happened is um, many of the delegates who were meeting in Philadelphia, they had been meeting off and on since 1774, and of course, the usual suspects were there: Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and of course George Washington. Um, a lot of them were split in terms of whether to stay English or maybe become independent. Uh, it was a constant bickering and back and forth, but it was an Englishman named Thomas Paine who basically said, "Look, you Americans, you've got all this land, all this resources, all this ingenuity. Um, um, you've been taking care of your own affairs for the better part of a century and a half, 2 centuries even. So uh, don't pay attention to this king guy and this parliament. These guys don't know what they're talking about. They're clowns, they're goons, they're thugs, they're this, they're bastards, blah blah blah." That's basically the gist of Paine's argument. So Paine was the one in his famous pamphlet Common Sense who essentially, you might say, flipped the switch, and many of the delegates, many of the upper class men who were meeting in Philadelphia decided, okay, independence is the way to go. So what Thomas Jefferson does is he takes a lot of Thomas Paine's arguments, and he also takes arguments from philosophers like John Locke, who had influenced Jefferson, and uh, and said in those famous phrase, "We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal." Of course, African Americans, Native Americans, and women were out of the equation. But thankfully, over time, the Declaration, you might say, has helped to bring in other peoples, welcome other peoples, and of course, and I would add Mexican Americans, Chicanos, into that mix over generations. But of course, back in 1776, it was just white men of means, white men of property. That was what Jefferson meant, and all men are created equal. So Rader talks about all of that stuff in the readings. Okay, Morgan's Declaration is mentioned in lecture outline 6, as well as a quick overview of some of the early battles of the Revolution, and then finish off the module with a PowerPoint on the Revolution itself. My PowerPoint program on the Revolution takes more of a look at the military angle, the tactics, the strategies, with people like of course Washington and his French friends. The French were only too willing. They were quite happy to help out because, of course, the French were humiliated by the English in the French and Indian War. So famous people like the Marquis de Lafayette and the Count de Rochambeau, they were major players who helped Washington and the American cause tremendously. And of course, there were some other Europeans too who were quite helpful. There was the Baron von Steuben from Germany, Tadeusz Kosciuszko, he was a famous Polish soldier of fortune. Um, And then, of course, he had Washington's men like Nathaniel Greene, Francis Marion. Basically, these guys, they weren't really that intent on, shall we say, beating the British in a full-scale battle. No, they were engaged in, you might say, hit-and-run activities. Taunt the British, engage in small skirmishes, but just tire them out, make them hate being there. So that was a strategy. Washington, his strategy wasn't to beat the British completely. His strategy was not to lose. That is, keep your army intact throughout the entirety of the revolution. And even though, of course, there were a lot of tough times for Washington. Of course, there was the campground. There was the campsite at Valley Forge, where everything looked pretty bleak. This is the winter of 1777-78. But the men persevered. They fought on, and of course everything came to its dramatic conclusion at the Battle of Yorktown in 1781. Once General once Lord Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown in 1781, it was pretty much all bets were off for the British. Not so much because they couldn't win militarily, but they couldn't win politically. They lost all support at home for this adventure. The more Washington and his men kept the British going and kept the fight going, the more Parliament lost patience, the more King George lost patience, and most importantly, the more the English people lost patience. They didn't like the idea of having to, shall we say, keep paying for this battle. Just seemed to drag on and on and on. By the time we get to the fall of 1781. But it's one thing to win the military campaign or to win the battle, but how do you form a nation? What happens after that? That'll be the focus of next week's module, and of course in next week's video, I'll talk a little bit more about that, about how both the United States and Mexico, even though they became roughly independent within a matter of decades of each other, they of course developed on completely different political, social, and economic lines, and we'll get to a lot more of that coming up in next week. All right, so that's it, everybody. So, I'm sorry, I got a little bit tongue-tied there from time to time, but it's a habit I've had from time to time in my on-campus sections. I had this professor from UCSD, Dr. Suarez Orozco, great guy from Argentina. I had him for many anthropology classes, and he had a tendency to talk. He would talk really fast and get super tongue-tied, and I had 4 classes with him in the late 80s and early 90s, and each class I had with him, he definitely did that. So I guess that's sort of a bad habit I picked up from him. But aside from that, aside from those little Daffy Duck or Porky Pig moments, I hope this video gave you a sense of what's happening for this week. I know we covered quite a bit of ground, but I hope between the video and the essay, the module overview essay itself, you got a sense of what's coming up for this week. All right, so that's it. Got 2 more of these preview videos to go, and then we start wrapping things up in the class. So that's it, you guys. Have a good week, and I'll talk to you guys again next week.